Hello everyone, welcome to the 14th lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. We are going to enter the 6th week from this lecture onward. In terms of 2 lectures, we are going to cover the third part of the modernization theory, and then from the 7th week, in the 7th week we will discuss or we will try to bring about a critique of modernization theory. What we have done in the first 5 weeks, in the first week we have discussed historical location of the idea of development. In the second week we have discussed decolonization, rise of nationalism in the third world and the desire for development. In the third week we have discussed classical sociology, Mine, Durkheim and others, and the notions of social change, ideas of evolution and progress. In the fourth week, we have discussed the first part of the modernization theory. If you look at this, we have discussed how the first sociological account of development was the modernization theory, which postulates that the less developed countries would eventually catch up with industrialized world, provided they emulated the economic and social systems of Western capitalism. Then we have discussed how modernization theory is the mainstream school of scholarship about poverty and economic, social and political development in the countries of the third world, and the adherents of the modernization approach do not actually see themselves as a cohesive school. They are more inclined to emphasize the disputes among them and to dismiss the dependency school as well as the Marxists as irrelevant or excessively doctrinal or political. And then we have discussed how an important idea in the modernization theory is the concept of the traditional society, and how modernization theory has been premised upon or has been based on the theoretical premises of structural functionalism, that is, society is composed on the basis of complementarity and reciprocity in the of roles in the social division of labor. How it is premised upon the creation and maintenance of the basic structures and institutions of a capitalist society, precisely because theories of modernization are explicitly or implicitly theories of capitalist development. And modernization theory conceptualized development as a staged transition from tradition to modernity, to be brought about at the economic level, at the social level and at the political level. And then we have discussed through the works of Hamza Alawi how modernization theory accorded central role to the state and public policy, and but it failed to examine the nature of the state itself, its location within the matrix of a class divided society and its relationship with contending social forces. Precisely because the state within the purview of the modernization school has been thought of as an entity that stands outside and above society. The state has been thought of as an autonomous agency that is invested potentially with an independent source of rationality enriched by technical assistance from metropolitan countries, and the state is also thought of as having the capability to initiate and pursue programs of development for the benefit of the whole of society. And that is how there is an implicit disjunction between the state and society, slurring over questions about the social foundations of political power and the making of public policy. The problematic of the state is then narrowed down to that of the efficacy of its public institutions and organs to achieve objectives and programs of modernization, focusing especially on the respective roles of ruling elites, dominant political parties, the bureaucracy and the military. And that is how we have discussed the relationship between the state and society in modernization theory. Then we have discussed how what is the similarity and the difference between theory of capitalist development and theory of socialist development. We have discussed political system and the state as constituting of the structures. An alternative view is the one that does not reify as a whole as functionalist theory does, but proceeds instead from the idea of the social process being constituted by interactions of free acting individuals. The market model nevertheless arrives at very similar conclusions to those of functionalist theory on issues of relevance. And we have discussed how reification is the process where the result of our actions appears to us as a quasi-natural thing or matter or object, because we do not recognize its social origins or process of creation that goes into its formation. And we have discussed economic markets, political markets, structural imperatives. I mean, when I say economic markets, I refer to foreign direct investment, free competition, structural imperatives. When I say political markets, I refer to political entrepreneurs aiming to maximize votes in terms of legislation, the application of laws and authoritative allocations of value. And structural imperative, I mean the imperative of capitalism, capitalism as a significant mode of production. Its imperative character lies in the fact that it determines the consequences of all such actions. It makes the new situations successively the basis on which fresh calculations are made and corrective action contemplated. And that is how we have discussed fundamental classes, auxiliary classes, fractions of a single class analogous to the division of the bourgeois in advanced capitalist countries into different fractions such as industrial capital, finance capital and commercial capital, class origins of the bureaucracy. We have also discussed how we have examined the distinction between traditional and modern societies. We have taken the cue from Weber via Talcott-Parsons in terms of Parsonian pattern variables, right. And I mean modernization refers to the process of transition from traditional to modern principles of social organization, and this process which is currently occurring in Asiatic, African and Latin American continents. We have also discussed traditional modern distinction, political development, Huntington's political order in changing societies, how Huntington, I mean we have discussed Huntington's political order as well as the class of civilizations through the lenses of social science theory, evidence and scientism as an ideology and so on. And in the fifth week we have discussed class, state and revolution through the lens of Theodor Sanin. I mean how radical upsurge of 1968 and its aftermath, they provided a scope where we can talk about the nature of revolutions, the revolutionary tactics and strategies. We have also discussed a search for the agencies of revolutionary change and analysis of the impediments that provided the crux of a threefold debate in terms of prospects of revolution and search for revolutionary class. Secondly, revolutionary organizations and their relation to the classes or masses. And thirdly, the state and revolution, nature of the state in societies where revolutions have been contained, in societies where revolutionaries challenge, and thirdly, in societies within which a revolution becomes institutionalized. We have discussed political context, then we have discussed Sanin's reflection on the potential of the empirical peasantry vis-a-vis the potential of the hypothetical proletariat, I mean the industrial working class, to bring about a social and political revolution, and for Sanin, class, state and revolution assume greater significance and their interrelations. Then we have discussed model and context, I mean the 1968 wave of revolutionary optimism, revolutionary army. The pertinent question that Sanin poses here, how do revolutions take place and succeed at all, rather than why do revolutions not take place more frequently. Okay, thereby he refers to Lenin. I mean successful revolutions, if you find, then you will find popular intervention in social structure, property relations, systems of domination, class divisions, typical forms of cognition, transformation of the state and removal of the rulers. Four major characteristics that in terms of crisis that we have discussed. A major crisis causing severe dislocation of society and its day to day functioning, a major crisis of the governing elite affecting its ability to govern, a crystallization of classes and subclasses expressed in a sharp way, increase in self identification and organization and militancy among class lines, and an effective revolutionary organization providing leadership in the political struggle. And then we have discussed how revolutions are critically embedded in an international context, relevant, often decisive for their outcome, and less developed countries, I mean societies, are at the underprivileged pole in a world capitalist system of inequalities, with consequences for important features of their eternal structures, indicating a particular kind of state, a particular kind of class system, and a particular kind of revolution. And then we have discussed Sanin's class state and revolution through the lens of the epiphenomenal state and the substitute bourgeois. Then we have discussed class and classness, I mean three-stage pattern of development, I mean how conservative technology of a handicraft system, revolutionary breakthrough in technology, and the new social relations introduced by industrialization that gave rise to massive and homogeneous proletariat, and the possibility that a powerful revolutionary push by them might result in revolution. Nevertheless, when and if revolutions fail to mature, a new situation begins to develop. And thirdly, heterogeneous and differentiated proletariat, occupational and status consciousness to tend to submerge class consciousness. Then we have discussed revolutionary potential of the industrial working class vis-a-vis peasantry. We have discussed the role of intellectuals in industrial societies as well as developing societies, and thereby we have referred to the works of Gramsci, who wrote in Prison Notebooks the role of organic intellectuals in party building, rationalism, creative freedom. I mean, when I say freedom, freedom to dissent is essentially integral to the idea of having freedom. Okay. Then we have discussed permanent vanguard and revolutionary class, I mean historical necessity of a revolutionary vanguard. We have discussed Modern Prince by Gramsci and the Manifesto of the Communist Party by Marx and Engels, class vanguard interdependence, party cadres organization, guided class action, in which a class is led and controlled by a revolutionary elite of relative outsiders with their conceptions of reality, organization, and corporate interest. Then we have discussed substitutes and realities to look at the relationship between class, state, and revolution. That is how we have completed 5 weeks. In the next, I mean in today's lecture and in the next lecture, we will complete the 6th week, 6 weeks of lectures. We will start with theories of modernization as essentially theories of capitalist development. Thereby, in these 2 lectures, what we are going to cover? We are going to cover finding pluriversal paths, which I am taking this term pluriverse, a post-development dictionary from Ashish Kothari, Ariel Saleh, Escobar, Demaria, and Acosta. Okay. In fact, Wolfgang Sachs, for the first time he wrote the development dictionary, but in 2019 the pluriverse, a post-development dictionary was published, 2019, almost after 50 years of the first publication of development dictionary by Wolfgang Sachs. What is the meaning of this called pluriverse? We are going to discuss. I mean, this is there cannot be any unidirectional linear model of development. There cannot be a single path of development. Rather, there must be multiple paths of development that Kothari, Escobar, and others they are arguing for. Okay. what we will do, we will discuss the essence of finding pluriversal paths in this lecture, today's lecture, and in the next lecture we will discuss the other things. The only thing why I am trying to look at only this one today and the others in the next class, precisely because you will find that this one is going to be more theoretical as compared to the other points that including breaking the chains of development by Bashi, development for the 1% by Vandana Siva, Maldevelopment by Jose Maria Torsosa, the development project by McMichael, the Latin American critique of development by Schwampa, and BRICS by Garcia and Bond. Okay, but we'll start with finding pluriversal paths, and we'll complete this today because it is more theoretical as compared to the other points that I have outlined. Finding pluriversal paths, I mean, this one was conceptualized by Assis Kothari, Ariel Saleh, Arturo Escobar, Federico Damaria, and Alberto Acosta. Okay? Now, we will see what is this finding pluriversal paths. There is no doubt that after decades of what has been called development, maybe 50-60 years of the discourse on development, or maybe 70 years of 70 if in the Indian context, maybe I will say maybe 73, 74 years of even after 74 years of independence, you will find that the catchword, the development that has perhaps that has become more important, or else it has lost its meaning over these 74 years, especially after the Second World War. Okay, more than 7 decades have elapsed, but we are still grappling with the questions of development. Okay, that's why I said there is no doubt that after decades of what has been called development, the world is in crisis. What kind of crisis? No, systemic, multiple, and asymmetrical crisis. Long in the making, it now extends across all continents. People earlier, they used to think that no, development is required only in the colonized nations, but today we look at this, but when we look at this, we also look at development in the advanced capitalist countries as well as in the less developed countries. Never before did so many so many crucial aspects of life fail simultaneously, and people's expectations for their own and children's futures look so uncertain. Crisis manifestations are felt across all domains, maybe be it environmental, economic, social, political, ethical, cultural, spiritual, and embodied. So, this course essentially is an act of renewal and repoliticization, where the term political implies a collaboration among dissenting voices over the kinds of alternative worlds that we want to create. Okay. Our aim should, I mean, what we are going to do here is to deepen and widen an agenda for research, dialogue, and action for scholars, policymakers, and activists. It should offer a variety of worldviews, perspectives, practices relating to our collective search for an ecologically wise and socially just world. This agenda should investigate the what, how, why, who, for whom, that is, of all that is transformative as distinct from that which is not. In the transition to a post-development world, which will be dealing with this post-development, will be dealing with in the last week of this course, when we will be dealing with globalization and development, also when we will be discussing limits to growth thesis and post development, you will find that there will be companions with strategic vision as well as agents with good short term tactical proposals. Democracy as life, starting from the body and moving on to democracy, when I say democracy as a process in permanent radicalization of itself, should speak to all areas of life, starting from the body and moving on to affirm its place in a living earth democracy. Earth democracy, when I say, I refer to Vandana Shiva, okay, who is the founder of Navadanya. They try to protect seeds, okay, for and on behalf of the farming community. The seductive nature of development, when I say the seductive nature of development, because development has been posed as a metaphor, development has been posed as a rhetoric, okay. That is what we have discussed in the initial classes, that the seductive nature of development rhetoric, sometimes known as developmentality or developmentalism, has been internalized across virtually all countries. Even some people who suffer the consequences of industrial growth in the global north accept a unilinear path of progress. Many nations of the global south have registered attempts at environmental regulation with the charge that the north is preventing the south from reaching its own level of development. The international debate then moves on to monetary and technology transfers from the global north to the global south. When I say global north to global south, which conveniently for the global north does not challenge basic premises of the development paradigm. These terms, global south and global north, are not geographic designations, but have economic and geopolitical implications. This is extremely important, not simply geopolitical implications, but also economic implications. Okay? This is important. Global north therefore may describe both historically dominant nations as well as colonized but wealthy ruling elites in the south. Similarly, for new alter globalization alliances, south can be a metaphor for exploited ethnic minorities or women in affluent countries, as much as the historically colonized or poorer countries as a whole. Decades after the notion of development spread around the world, only a handful of countries called underdeveloped or developing or third world, to use deprecating Cold War terms, really qualify as developed. Others struggle to emulate the North's developed countries' economic template, and all at enormous ecological and social cost. There is a misconception here. The problem lies not in lack of implementation, but in the conception of development as linear, unidirectional, material and financial growth driven by commodification and capitalist markets. Despite numerous attempts to re-signify development, it continues to be something that experts manage in pursuit of economic growth and measure by gross domestic product or GDP, a poor and misleading indicator of progress in the sense of well-being. In truth, the world at large experiences maldevelopment, even in the very industrialized countries whose lifestyle was meant to serve as a beacon for the backward ones. A critical part of our problems lies in the conception of modernity itself, not to suggest that everything modern is destructive or iniquitous, nor that all tradition is positive. Indeed, modern elements such as human rights and feminist principles are proving liberatory for many people. We refer to modernity as the dominant worldview emerging in Europe since the Renaissance transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern period and consolidating towards the end of the 18th century. Not least among these cultural practices and institutions has been a belief in the individual as independent of the collective and in private property, free markets, political liberalism and secularism, and representative democracy. Another key feature of modernity is universalism, the idea that we all live in a single, now globalized, and critically the idea of science as the only reliable truth and harbinger of progress. Among the early causes of this multiple crisis is the ancient and monotheistic premise that a Father God made the earth for the benefit of his human children. This attitude is known as anthropocentrism. At least in the West, it evolved into a philosophic habit of pitting humanity against nature and gave rise to related dualisms such as the divide between the subject and object, mind and body, masculine versus feminine, civilized versus barbarian. And these classic ideological categories, these dichotomies which modernization theory has been celebrating over time and across space, legitimize devastation of the natural world as well as the exploitation of sex, gender, racial and civilizational differences. Feminists emphasize the masculinist culture of domination carried by these artificial pairs, artificially constructed dichotomies, binaries. Intellectuals in the global south emphasize their coloniality. The modern colonial capitalist patriarchal world system thus marginalizes and demeans forms of knowing such as caregiving and non-Western law, science or economics. This is the prevailing political pattern globally, yet there have been alternative forms in Europe as well as minorities in Latin America, China and so forth. We want to encompass a variety of visions reaching from the current globalizing development model to non-modern and self-defined alternatives. Many of these radical worldviews would fit into the second and or third categories. In giving voice to diversity, we you will find that when we talk about diversity, the global crisis is not manageable within existing institutional frameworks. It is historical and structural, demanding a deep cultural awakening and reorganization of relations both within and between societies across the world, as also between humans and the rest of so-called nature. As humans, our most important lesson is to make peace with the earth and with each other. Everywhere people are experimenting with how to meet their needs in ways that assert the rights and dignity of earth and its threatened inhabitants. The search is a response to ecological collapse, land grabs, oil wars and forms of extractivism such as agro-industry and plantations of genetically engineered species. In human terms, this theft brings loss of rural livelihoods and urban poverty. Sometimes Western progress gives way or leads to diseases of affluence, alienation and rootlessness. But people's resistance movements are now taking place across every continent. If you look at the Environmental Justice Atlas that documents and catalogues over 2000 conflicts proving the existence of an active global environmental justice movements, even if it is not yet a united one. And there is no guarantee that development will resolve traditional discrimination and violence against women, youth, children and intersex minorities, landless and unemployed classes, races, castes and ethnicities. Okay. That is why development must be examined in relation to or vis-a-vis these things, traditional discrimination and violence against women, youth, children, intersex minorities, landless and unemployed classes, races, castes and ethnicities. As globalizing capital destabilizes regional economies, turning communities into wasted lives and refugee populations, some people cope by identifying with the power of the political right. This prioritizes national identity and promises to take the jobs back from the migrant scapegoats. At times, and I mean, we all find that a drift towards authoritarianism is taking place all over the world, not simply in the United States of America or a part of Europe or even in India today. Okay? The illusion of representative democracy is kept alive by a privileged technocratic class with its neoliberal trajectory of innovation for green growth. There is a fuzzy line between the ideologies when it comes to productivism, modernization and progress. Moreover, each such ideology builds on Eurocentric and masculinist values, so reinforcing the status quo. Marx, for example, I am going to discuss Marx and Gramsci. Very briefly, of course, Marx, who reminded us that when a new society is born from inside the old, it drags many defects of the old system along with it. Later, Gramsci would observe of his time that the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. What these European left intellectuals did not anticipate was how today alternatives are also emerging from the political margins, from both the colonial periphery and the domestic periphery of capitalism. The Marxist analysis remains necessary, but it is not, maybe it is not adequate. It needs to be complemented by perspectives such as feminism and ecology, as well as imaginations emanating from the global south, including the Gandhian ideals. In a time of transition such as this, critique and action call for new narratives combined with hands-on material solutions. Doing more of the same, the better, or less of the same is not enough. The way forward is not simply to make corporations more accountable or to set up regulative bureaucracies. It is not even a matter of recognizing full citizenship for the colored, elderly, disabled, women or queer through liberal pluralist policy. Likewise, the conservation of a few pristine patches of nature at the margins of urban capitalism will have little effect on the collapse of biodiversity. This is how we live in a time when the models of development, I mean the 20th century models of development, I mean namely liberal conservative democracy, liberal representative democracy and state socialism have become incoherent and dysfunctional forms of governance, even if achieving welfare and rights for a few. Accordingly, what we encounter today, the limits of developmentalism as it shapes reformist solutions to global crisis. Here we see the ghost of modernity reincarnated in infinite ways, as short-sighted crisis remedies of those in power keep the north-south status quo in place. You look at market mechanisms, geoengineering, climate smart agriculture, the population question, green economics, reproductive engineering, transhumanism and so on. An overarching theme is the much celebrated political gesture of sustainable development. Okay? Of course, even well-intentioned people may inadvertently promote superficial or false solutions to global problems. Then again, it is not easy to distinguish mainstream or superficial initiatives from radical transformative ones in these days when the military industrial media complex and greenwashing industry promotions are at their seductive best. Criticism of industrialization is not new. Mary Shelley, Karl Marx, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, each in their own way expressed misgivings about it, as have many people's movements throughout the last 2 centuries. The early 20th century debate on sustainability was strongly influenced by the Club of Rome's limits to growth thesis. Argument and official circles have expressed concern about mass production technologies and consumption patterns since the 1972 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Stockholm. Regular conferences at a global level would reiterate the mismatch between development and environment, with the 1987 report Our Common Future bringing it sharply into focus. However, the United Nations and most nation state analyses have never included a critique of social structural forces underlying ecological breakdown. The framing has always been on making economic growth and development, sustainable and inclusive through appropriate technologies, markets and institutional policy reform. The problem is that this mantra of sustainability was swallowed up by capitalism early on and then emptied of ecological content. In the period from 1980s onwards, newly globalization advanced aggressively across the globe. The United Nations now shifted focus to a program of poverty alleviation in developing economies, without questioning the sources of poverty in the accumulation driven economy of the affluent global north, developed countries. In fact, it was argued that countries needed to achieve a high standard of living before they could deploy resources in protecting the environment. So, economic growth was redefined as a necessary step. This watering down of earlier debates on limits opened the way for the ecological modernist green economy concept. The new millennium has seen, the 21st century has seen a plethora of such Keynesian proposals: bioeconomy, the green revolution for Africa, the Chinese and European promotion for the circular economy, and the recent one, the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. Okay, the title is transforming our world, the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. Okay. At the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development in 2012, this hollow sustainability ideology was the guiding framework for multilateral discussions. For some time, the United Nations environmental program, together with the corporate sector, some even on the political left, had been talking enthusiastically about the need for a Green New Deal. In preparation for Rio Plus 20, Rio de Janeiro, UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, published a report on the green economy, defining it as the one that results in improved human well-being and social equity while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities. In line with the pro-growth policy of sustainable development advocates, the report conceptualized all living natural forms across the planet as natural capital and critical economic assets. So, intensifying the marketable commodification of life on earth. However, opposition from ultra-globalization activists was fierce. The official Rio Plus 20 final declaration advocates economic growth in more than 20 of its articles. This approach is based on a supposed greening of neoclassical economic theory called environmental economics, a belief that growth can de-link or decouple itself from nature through dematerialization and depollution of what is called eco-efficiency. However, empirical cradle to grave and social metabolism studies from ecological economics show that such production has dematerialized in relative terms, using less energy and materials per unit of GDP, gross domestic product, but it has not reduced overall or absolute amounts of materials and energy, which is what matters for sustainability. Historically, the only periods of absolute dematerialization coincide with economic recession. The popular idea of economic efficiency falls far short of respecting biophysical limits in nature as well as natural resources, in economic in ecosystem assimilative capacity, or in planetary boundaries. The international model of green revolution, green capitalism carried forward in the declaration transforming our world, the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, that reveals the following these flaws in what have become known as the sustainable development goals, okay? SDGs. I mean, no analysis of how the structural roots of poverty, unsustainability and multidimensional violence are historically grounded in state power, corporate monopolies, neocolonialism and patriarchal institutions. Inadequate focus on direct democratic governance with accountable decision making by citizens and self-aware communities in face-to-face settings. Continued emphasis on economic growth as the driver of development, contradicting biophysical limits with arbitrary adoption of GDP as the indicator of progress. Continued reliance or dependence on economic globalization as the key economic strategy, undermining people's attempts at self-reliance and autonomy. Continued subservience to private capital and unwillingness to democratize the market through worker, producer and community control. Modern science and technology held up as social panaceas, ignoring their limits and impacts and marginalizing other knowledge, culture, ethics and spirituality sidelined and made subservient to economic forces. Unregulated consumerism without strategies to reverse the developed world's disproportionate contamination of the globe through waste, toxicity and climate emissions. Neoliberal architectures of global governance becoming increasingly reliant on technocratic managerial values by state and multilateral bureaucracies. This 2015 framework this framework was framed. This framework was formulated. And this framework appeared in 2015, and this 2015 framework of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, now global in its reach, is a false consensus. For instance, it calls for sustained economic growth, which enters into contradictions with the majority of the SDGs. If what Guwahati, Escobar and others, they argue here that if development is seen as a toxic term to be rejected, then sustainable development becomes an oxymoron. More specifically, the degrowth theorist Kallis has commented, Kallis has commented, sustainable development and its more recent reincarnation, green growth, depoliticize genuine political antagonisms between alternative visions for the future. They render environmental problems technical, promising win-win situations and the impossible goal of perpetuating economic growth without harming the environment. And this is what happens with reformist solutions. What Guwahati, Escobar, Saleh, Demaria and Acosta, they try to argue that they don't imply to it doesn't imply to belittle the work of people who are finding new technological solutions to reduce problems, for example in renewable energy, nor do they mean to diminish the many positive elements contained in the SDG framework. Rather, what they want to do, they want to stress upon they want to stress that in the absence of fundamental socio-cultural transformation, technological and managerial innovation will not lead us out of the crisis. As nation states and civil societies gear up for the sustainable development goals, it is imperative to lay out criteria to help people make such a distinction. In counterpoint to the blinders of conventional political reason, the objective is to gather together a range of complementary notions and practices that form radical and systemic initiatives. Some of these revive or creatively reinterpret long-standing indigenous worldviews, others come from recent social movements, yet others revisit other older philosophies and religious traditions. I mean, together these perspectives, these multiple perspectives, they compose a pluriverse, a world where many worlds fit. All people's worlds should coexist with dignity and peace without being subjected to diminishment, exploitation and misery. A pluriversal world overcomes patriarchal attitudes, racism, casteism and other forms of discrimination. Here people relearn what it means to be a humble part of nature, living behind narrow anthropocentric notions of progress based on economic growth. While many pluriversal articulations synergize with each other, unlike the universalizing ideology of sustainable development, they cannot be reduced to an overarching policy for administration either by the United Nations or some other global governance regime or by regional or state regimes. We envision a world confluence of alternatives provoking strategies for transition, including small everyday actions towards a great transformation. And that is how there is an attempt to deconstruct development. Okay? That deconstruction of development is important, that opens into a matrix of alternatives from universe to pluriverse. Some visions and practices are already well known in activist and academic circles. It rests on a hypothesis that there are thousands of such transformative initiatives around the world, from north, south, east, west. If you look at each trend in the development rainbow, or rather post development rainbow, symbolizes human emancipation within nature. And it is the, what Aldo Leopold would say, that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability and the beauty of the biotic community, and it is wrong when it tends otherwise. That is what the pluriversal project from cultural relativistic standpoint. While making peace with the earth, another peacemaking goal is linking ancestral and contemporary knowledge together in a process that will demand horizontal and respectful dialogue. That said, there are no blueprints valid for all times and places, just as no theory is immune to questioning. Indeed, this kind of historical reflexivity is only now becoming recognized as a terrain of politics. The response to macro power structures like capital and empire is a well-travelled landscape. What is still largely unexplored is the field of micro or capillary power that feeds everyday violence. Honorable rhetorics of abstract justice, even spiritual pines or to Mother Earth will not suffice to bring about the changes we want. And therein lies the significance of the term development. Building a pluriversal house means digging a new foundation. Transformative initiatives differ from mainstream or reformist solutions in a number of ways. Ideally, they will go to the roots of a problem. They will question what they have already identified as core features of the development discourse, economic growth, productivism, the rhetoric of progress, instrumental rationality, markets, universality, anthropocentrism and sexism. These transformative alternatives will encompass an ethic that is radically different from the one underpinning the current system. The entries what we are going to discuss very briefly now. There are many paths towards biocivilization, diversity and pluriversality, autonomy and self-reliance, solidarity and reciprocity, commons and collective ethics, oneness with and rights of nature, interdependence, simplicity, enoughness, inclusiveness and dignity, justice and equity, non-hierarchy, division of labor, dignity of labor, rights and responsibilities, ecological sustainability, non-violence and peace and so on. Political agency that belongs to when it will belong to the marginalized, exploited and the oppressed, I mean transformations will integrate and mobilize multiple dimensions, though not necessarily all at one go. One exemplar of that vision might be the set of confluences called Bikalp Sangam taking place in India since 2014. The values advanced by this movement are ecological wisdom, integrity and resilience. I mean where primacy is given to maintaining eco-generative processes that conserve ecosystems, species, functions and cycles, respecting ecological limits from local to global, and where there is an infusion of ecological ethics into all human activities. Secondly, social well-being and justice, where fulfillment is physical, social, cultural and spiritual. There is equity in socio-economic and political entitlements and responsibilities, non-discriminatory relations and communal harmony, replace hierarchies based on faith, gender, caste, class, ethnicity, ability and age, and where collective and individual human rights are ensured. Thirdly, direct and delegated democracy, where consensus decision making occurs at the smallest unit of settlement, in which every human has the right, capacity and opportunity to take part, establishing democratic governance by directly accountable delegates in ways that are consensual, respectful and supportive of the needs and rights of those currently marginalized, for example, young people and or religious minorities. Fourthly, economic democratization, where private property gives way to the commons, removing the distinction between owner and worker, where communities and individuals, ideally prosumers, have autonomy over local production, distribution and markets, where localization is a key principle with trade built on the principle of equal exchange. And last but not the least, cultural diversity and knowledge democracy, I mean where a plurality of ways of living, ideas and ideologies are is respected, creativity and innovation are encouraged, and the generation, transmission and use of knowledge, whether it is traditional or modern, including science and technology, is accessible to all. So, if you look at these paths, you will find that the other half of humanity, the constituting of women, where are they? I mean, how do we ensure that development pluriverse or a post-development pluriverse does not dissolve coloniality while keeping women in their place as the material bearers of everyday life activities? A first step in the anticipation of deep systemic change is to question how both traditional and modern practices and knowledge privilege masculinity and the opportunities that go with it. Originally, the two words economy and ecology shared the one Greek root oikos, meaning our home. But soon enough, this unity was broken apart as men's self-appointed domination over nature came to include the exploitation of women's energies. While whole civilizations have been built on the sex-gendered control of women's fertility, the quintessential resource for continuance of any political regime, and this turned women into means not ends, mere chattels, so taking away their standing as full human individuals in their own right. Ironically, the economy or productive sector as it is known in the global north, in the developed world, now destroys its very own social and ecological foundations of the reproductive sector. You look at Latin American and Pacific feminisms, peace women, matriarchies, wages for housework, body politics, gift economies and ecofeminism. Most of these initiatives are grounded in women's struggles for survival. They link political emancipation with environmental justice, local problems with global structures, usually arguing for sustainable subsistence against linear progress and catch-up development. Conversely, mainstream Western feminism tends to be anthropocentric, such that liberal and even socialist feminists may be pacified with the global goal of equality, and in this way their politics unwittingly band-aids existing masculinist institutions. Okay. If you look at these varieties, now one may question the confidence that is invested in the idea of community. You can it is a contested term, community, one that can readily hide expressions based on sex, gender, age, class, caste, ethnicity, race or ability, and we I mean the people also recognize that localized governance or economies are often xenophobic. A parochialism seen currently in the nationalist opposition to refugees in many parts of the world. India is no exception to this, beset by intolerance on the right and a defensive identity politics. I mean the compendium of alternatives reaches for integrative and inclusive practices. The ideal of community envisaged here carries the paradigmatic sense of today's movements towards commoning. Okay. Many radical worldviews and practices are at work today. The very proliferation of adjacents coming from these other worlds is important. In responding to the ecological crisis, experts in the global north, I mean the developed world, take the categories of one world responsible for devastation of the planet as the very point of departure for their alleged solutions. However, their commitment to such cannot enlighten us on the fundamental task of making the pluriverse sustainable. To repeat, the notion of the pluriverse questions the very concept of universality that is so central to only European modernity. And with that phrase, a world where many worlds fit perhaps will not work, whereas the developed world, the colonizers managed to sell its own idea of own world known only by modern science and ruled by its own cosmovision. The alter globalization movements propose pluriversality as a shared project based on the multiplicity of ways of worlding under conditions of asymmetric power. Indigenous peoples have had to alienate their own common sense experience of the world and learn how to live with the Eurocentric masculinist dualism between humans and non-humans, which led them to treat indigenous people as non-human and natural resources. They resist this separation when they mobilize on behalf of mountains, lakes or rivers, arguing that these are sentient beings with rights, not mere objects or resources. Conversely, many thinking people in the industrialized world are demanding rights for the rest of nature to be expressed in law and policy, and in so doing they are taking a step towards incorporating something that indigenous peoples have always integrated into their worldview, but they are doing so in the formal ways that they are familiar with. There is a long way to go for the multiplicity of worlds to become fully complementary with each other, but movements for justice and ecology are finding increasing common ground. So too women's political struggles converge upon this same point. In both the global north and global south, it is most often ordinary caregiving mothers and grandmothers who join this entanglement, defending and reconstituting communal ways of being and place-based forms of autonomy. In doing so, they, like the indigenous others described earlier, which we have discussed earlier, draw upon non-patriarchal ways of doing, being and knowing. They invite participation, collaboration, respect, and mutual acceptance and horizontality. They honor sacredness in the cyclic renewal of life. Their tacitly matriarchal cultures resist ontologies founded on domination, hierarchy, control, power, the negation of others, violence and war. From the worldwide movement of peace women to African anti-extremist networks, women are defending nature and humanity with the clear message that there can be no decolonization without depatriarchalization. Such initiatives resonate powerfully with the post-development concepts profiled here. I mean solidarity, reciprocity, non-violence, peace and so on. For the pluriverse is not just a fashionable concept, it is a practice. That is what Guwahati, Escobar and others there say. If it is a practice, then societal imaginaries based on human rights and the rights of nature are impossible to arrive at through top-down intervention. Initiatives such as the transition movement or eco-villages can contain a mix of reformist and broader systemic changes. Emancipatory projects will rely on solidarity across continents and they can work hand in hand with resistance movements. How do we get here to there? I mean, if you look at this, we are after all talking about profound shifts in the spheres of economy, politics, society, culture and lived sexuality. Transitioning implies accepting an ensemble of measures and changes in different domains of life and at different geographic scales. Transitions can be messy and not fully radical, but can be considered alternative if they at least hold a potential for living change. Given the diversity and of imaginative visions across the globe, the question of how to build synergies among them remains open. There will be setbacks, as Guwahati and others argue. Strategies will fade along the way and others will emerge. Differences, tensions, even contradictions will exist, but these can become a basis for constructive exchange. The ways toward a pluriverse are multiple, open and in continuous evolution. Then what we have discussed today? We have discussed how theories of modernization are explicitly or implicitly theories of capitalist development, that is premised upon the fact that the creation and maintenance of basic institutions and structures of a capitalist society. We have discussed only this point, the first point, finding pluriversal paths in this lecture in terms of sustainable development goals, in terms of ecological wisdom, integrity and resilience, social well-being and justice, direct and delegated democracy, economic democratization, cultural diversity and knowledge democracy. And in the next lecture we are going to discuss breaking the chains of development, development for the 1%, maldevelopment, the development project, the Latin American critique of development and BRICS, I mean Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Thank you.